All right, everybody, welcome. This is the Otherppl Show, a weekly podcast featuring in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. I'm Brad Listi, and I'm here in Los Angeles. This is my podcast. I appreciate you being here. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and you can follow me on Instagram and Bluesky. So today is Thursday, and usually on Thursdays there's a new episode of Brad and Mira for The Culture, this podcast's weekly pop culture assessment. But Mira is out again with yet another emergency. Her pet, her dog, has been experiencing some health issues and had to be taken to the vet. So Mira is out this week, and in place of Brad and Mira, I'm going to share with you today an excellent conversation that I had with Vauhini Vara, who is returning to the show for a second time, celebrating the publication of a new work of nonfiction entitled Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. It is available from Pantheon, and it is a braided narrative. It's a kind of hybrid form. I love these kinds of books. It's a memoir. It's journalistic. It's essayistic. It's an exploration of how technology companies have both fulfilled and exploited the human desire for understanding and connection, but it's also a very personal narrative. It's like a book about Vauhini's relationship with technology, the way that it has helped her and maybe hindered her in her attempts to understand herself and to relate to other people. It's also about her upbringing and her family, and it deals with the loss of her sister, Deepa, to cancer when Vauhini was in college. So it's a very moving book, and there's not a person I can think of who would be better suited to writing a book about technological capitalism and its implications for humanity than Vauhini Vara, because she was the Wall Street Journal's first reporter on the Facebook beat back in the day, and she has done a lot of writing professionally about this stuff over the years, and I just loved Searches. You will hear my conversation with Vauhini Vara in just a couple of minutes. Before we get there, I do want to remind you that I have a weekly email newsletter. You can sign up over at bradlisti.substack.com. I will let you know about the latest episodes of this program. I also share a list of links to things that I've been reading and finding interesting. So head on over to Substack and sign up for my newsletter, if that sounds good. I also want to remind you that my new company, Deep Dive, will be launching soon. Deep Dive specializes in the creation of long-form educational audio, and the debut course from Deep Dive is called How to Write a Novel. Vauhini Vara, who published a novel called The Immortal King Rao, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, she is a featured instructor in how to write a novel. And I have finished post-production, and I'm kind of in like the final phase of the operation before we get to launch. So it's getting there, and it's coming together, and I'm very excited about it. If you want to get on the waiting list, you can go to www.deepdive.audio and drop your email address into the little field, the form. You know how it works. And I'll get you on the wait list, and I will be letting everybody know, both here on the show and of course via email, when Deep Dive is ready to roll. So stay tuned for that. How to Write a Novel. It features more than 50 hours of instruction from dozens of today's leading writers. So this is a pretty monumental writing course. I am the host of the course, and it proceeds as a series of conversations or dialogues with people about various aspects of writing a novel and being a novelist. So I don't know. I'm both exhausted because I've been working so hard on it, and I'm elated because it's coming together, and I'm excited to share it with you. I will let you know as soon as it's ready. So my guest, once again, is Vauhini Vara. Her new book is called Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age, available from Pantheon. Vauhini has been a reporter and editor for The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and the New York Times Magazine, and she is the prize-winning author of the novel The Immortal King Rao and a story collection entitled This Is Salvaged. She lives in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I am very pleased to welcome her back here onto the Otherppl show for this conversation.
In 2019, I realized that Google had been tracking all of my searches in Google since like 2005. And this was something that I knew Google generally did, but I was under the impression that I had turned those settings off. And apparently I hadn't. It was like, as a journalist covering technology, I had written about all the different ways in which technology companies use our personal information and all the different ways that we can control that to an extent. And yet apparently I had not asked Google not to track all of my searches over the years. So I realized that it had been doing that. And I just on a whim was sort of going through my old searches and seeing what I had searched for over the years. And what really struck me is that even though I'm a writer and I have learned in writing classes and in community with other writers that the thing to do if you're a writer, especially if you're writing personally, is to be vulnerable and intimate on the page and candid and say things that are embarrassing or maybe put you in a negative light. I realized that I was doing that far more explicitly with Google in my Google searches than I often did in my own published work, which struck me as intellectually interesting and emotionally interesting because I don't get paid for the writing that I do with Google as my addressee, right? It's actually Google gets paid to an extent because Google is then monetizing what it knows about me through my Google searches. And I wanted to see if there was a way, a forum that would let me express that on the page. And so I ended up writing this essay made up of my own Google searches over a 10-year period that I published in the New York Times. And the goal there was to, in some ways, see if I could reappropriate all this language for myself and turn it into art and define it sort of according to my own terms, my own sense of value that was different from Google's sense. But then also to engage through the essay itself in a kind of critique of the way in which we provide these companies with so much information about ourselves and they benefit financially from it. And so I was trying to do kind of a couple of different things at the same time. Once I did that, I became really interested in just the general fact that these big technology companies are the recipients of so much of our communication nowadays, right? I write more words in Google than I do in literally in my Google searches than I do in many other places. I review products on Amazon. I, engage with AI products. And so I started becoming interested in all the ways in which I could use these forums themselves to say something about the forums. So that's where the book started. So I had all these pieces that were these experimental pieces, one made up of my own Google searches, another made up of my own Amazon reviews, several experiments I was undertaking having to do with AI. And I thought that was the book. I thought I was going to publish a book that was just all these experiments. And then I sent that book, I sold that book actually to Lisa Lucas, my previous editor at Pantheon. She bought that book and then I sent her that book. And when she sent me her notes and we talked on the phone, she said something like, I think what the subtext is of all these experimental pieces you've written, but I don't know that anybody else is going to know unless you tell us. I think you need more kind of writing that just contextualizes what these are. And she suggested an introduction and a conclusion to a book that would otherwise still just be these experimental pieces. But after I absorbed her feedback, I thought, I think what I really need is for this not to be a collection of essays, but rather to be a sort of book length piece of writing in which I have all these experimental pieces, but each of them is set up by a more narrative chapter that gives people the context they need to understand the experimental piece. So for example, this Google searches piece is chapter 2 of the book now, but I have a chapter 1 talking all about how search evolved both in my life, search as a product evolved, like both in my life as a user of search, but also more broadly, I'm doing some journalistic writing about like how search functions, what the benefits of it are, but also the ways in which it allows Google and other companies to exploit us. And so I'm kind of like doing that throughout the book.
Yeah. I mean, it's a braided narrative. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of great technology writing and there's lots of great experimentation on the page. But for me, the through line is the personal narrative. It's a very personal book and it's a very human book. So these things are in juxtaposition to one another, where you're engaging with AI and yet you're writing about deep grief that you've experienced, like when you lost your sister Deepa. And you're also talking about feeling like an alienated teen coming of age at a time when everyone was just getting online and the internet, and I guess even maybe social media at a later date was in its nascent stages. And you were also in a place living in Seattle on Mercer Island at the time that was kind of at least one of the big cradles of the world that we live in now, technologically and economically.
Yeah.
And so when I came away from this book after finishing it, what occurred to me, or the way that I conceived of it, is that it's a book about relationships. Like, this is a memoir primarily, I think, of your relationship with technology. But it's also a memoir about your relationship with your sister and with family members. And I guess like maybe more briefly, a relationship of the beginnings, at least, of your relationship with your husband. But that's the word that came to me, was relationships. And that's an interesting word to surface in a book that is so driven by questions around technology and this kind of like hyper technological future that we seem to be careening into.
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes sense to me that would occur to you, because what I was especially interested in, I think, with this book was all the languages we use to communicate with one another, like the way in which the thing that's available to us in relationships in order to connect with other human beings is language. And maybe that's like oral language or written language, or maybe it's visual language, or maybe it's gestures, but like, it's so fundamental to being human in relation to other human beings. It's something that's like really special about our species, I think, the way in which we've invented all these languages that allow us to communicate at a high level. And it's also the medium that big technology companies are using to engage with us through their products, right? And provide us with things that are useful and also exploit us at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so I was going to kind of hold out and try to get to this later, but I guess we might as well just confront it. And that's like AI, because I see so much hand-wringing about AI, especially in the literary community on social media. People are very anti, and yet I am like using ChatGPT with increasing frequency, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
And you use ChatGPT both as a technology reporter, but also creatively in this book, like feeding chapters of your book into ChatGPT and then asking it for a response and then publishing those responses in the book. So this is possibly the first book that I've read that integrates AI. I'm not to say it's the first book ever published that does so.
Yeah.
I'm sure there have been others, but this is the first one that I've read. And it's very fascinating to me. It's fascinating on the page in your book, but it's also just fascinating to me, period, because I'm like, this is crazy technology where I can ask this thing questions and it's giving me like pretty sophisticated answers in a matter of seconds and simplifying my life in many respects. So it's like, it's a useful tool. And I know it gets stuff wrong. And I know that it's like dehumanizing. Like, am I crazy to be engaging with it? Am I making a mistake? Have I missed something fundamental about the evil of this technology? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, where do you land on it at this stage of things?
I mean, I have a lot of concerns about AI products. I think sometimes we conflate like AI in general with big tech owned AI. And I think the reason we do that is because the products we currently tend to use are the products from big technology companies, right? Like OpenAI and Google and Microsoft. I tend to think that in a vacuum, technologies can have a sort of neutrality about them. The issue is that many of the technologies that we use, including AI, are so expensive to build that their creation becomes bound up like from the start in the desires of big technology companies that have the capital to build them. So, I mean, with all of the products I engage with in the book, so Google, Amazon, ChatGPT, certainly, what I was interested in was the promise that the companies behind these products are making when they offer us their products, the extent to which they fulfill those promises, because they do to an extent, as you're pointing out, and then the ways in which they fall short. And more interestingly to me, the ways in which they ultimately benefit from our use of the products, right? So like all of that is bound up together for me. Certainly. So the way when I described how the book is structured, I talked about everything other than the ChatGPT stuff, right? So it's like, I think of the book as having these pairs of chapters where like chapter 1 is a more traditional chapter that's introducing a more experimental chapter 2. The same is true of chapter 3 and chapter 4. But between each of those little kind of couplets of chapters, there's this running dialogue with ChatGPT that I start at the very beginning of the book where I say to ChatGPT, hey, I want to get your feedback on some writing of mine. I'm going to give it to you 2 chapters at a time, right? I was interested there in doing the same thing that I was interested in doing with the other products. Like I was interested in exploring the promise OpenAI is making with a product like ChatGPT, which in the case of like the context of my book is if you use this product, it can help you make your book better, right? OpenAI and other companies like this are very much positioning their products as things that can make our lives easier. And in the context of writing, can make our writing better, can give us feedback. So I'm kind of like testing that premise, I think, in the conversation, in the dialogue with ChatGPT. In my reading of the dialogue in my book, ChatGPT doesn't really offer anything particularly useful. And in fact, offers text suggesting ultimately that I write a book that's more positive about big tech, about AI, about Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. And that's what I found especially interesting about the dialogue. And that's the reason ultimately I included the dialogue in the book, because I wanted to show readers like what happens when we engage with these products on terms set by the big technology companies, right? I wanted to show how ChatGPT is doing this in the book and couching it in very sort of like objective sounding, empathetic sounding language, such that a reader or a user like might not even fully absorb the fact that they're being manipulated.
That's what's so crazy about it, is that it could be in the wrong hands, very sinister, and it could be subtly so. So it's not, like you say, super obvious that it's happening, and you have to be really vigilant in order to recognize it. And then there is an issue, and I don't know if we talked about this in your previous appearance on this show, but I know that I definitely talked about it with Jared Kobeck because he brought it to my attention. He wrote a novel called I Hate the Internet. And so, he had lived up in the Bay Area and, I think had worked in tech, or at least was near it and had thoughts. But he pointed out to me that social media was built almost entirely by white dudes or by men. And there are implications to that. And I'd never thought about that. Like I never really sat around, because I don't sit around thinking about coders typically. Yeah. But, these technologies, when they are built, if they are built primarily by people of a single nationality or a single race or a single gender, all of those kinds of things are going to impact the end result. Yeah. And so the same, I think, is happening again with AI. It's mostly dudes who are building these things, right?
Yeah. And I think it has partly to do with the individuals who are literally working at tech companies building these products. I would argue that it has more to do with the influence of those who are funding the development of the products, right? And those who are, in the CEO role at these kinds of companies and at other high level executive roles, because those are the people who are really driving the direction of these companies and what the goals of the products are. So I think it's a combination.
And so I was talking earlier about how you're very well suited to tell the story that you tell in this book because of your upbringing, the timing of your life, kind of, and how it's synchronous with the advent of the internet and social media. You sort of track these technological developments as you've come of age. Also, that you grew up in Seattle. And so you were, like, I think, in the same general neighborhood as Paul Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft. And of course, Jeff Bezos is like, is it Bezos or Bezos? Do we have
know
a
it
verdict?
As Bezos. That's how I know it.
Okay. So Bezos is living nearby and building Amazon as you're growing up. And then you also went to Stanford, which is, I think, the elite school of the tech world. Like, right, it's of all the schools, it's probably produced the most Silicon Valley millionaires, I would guess.
Yeah.
And Sam Altman was, a freshman when you were a senior? So you guys actually overlapped at Stanford for at least a year?
That's right.
And you then went on to become a tech reporter for the Wall Street Journal, covering the Oracle beat. And then eventually, I think, Facebook and Apple? Did you do both of those too?
Just the Facebook beat.
Oh, just the Facebook beat. And then went on to write about tech for the New Yorker as well, and have since written about it all over the place. So you're the perfect person, in my view, to write a book like this and to engage with these technologies. And I just love to hear you talk a little bit more about the Stanford part of it, and then maybe take us into conversations that you've had, which you address in the book, with Sam Altman. Yeah. Like, you've actually interacted with Zuckerberg. You've interacted with Sam Altman.
Yeah.
Most of us have not, other than maybe liking one of their posts or something, but it's never reciprocal. What is your take on, like, the Stanford pipeline and your experiences there? And then, connected to that, your interactions with these Silicon Valley bros who are sort of like the lords of their own kingdoms.
Yeah. I went to Stanford at such an interesting time. I arrived there in 2000 and I graduated in 2004. So that means that when I arrived, the founders of Google had just left, like a year or two earlier, but they had built Google within Stanford and then dropped out so that they could turn Google into a company. My senior year at Stanford, Facebook came to campus, and it was the third campus that Facebook had opened in. The first was Harvard, where the founders went to school. I think the second was Columbia, and then the third was Facebook. And I was an editor at the school paper, so I edited the first stories we published about Facebook. And even back then, we have Mark Zuckerberg saying things like, my goal is to connect people. And, the rhetoric that he still uses was already being developed then. He also said back then, I don't know that we really have much of a need to start making money through advertising anytime soon, because it's not that expensive to run this company, which is a very interesting in the context of how the company later developed. And then, I graduated and started covering Facebook, later profiled Sam Altman. What I find interesting about that whole milieu is that I think it's tempting to say, the tech bros running these companies are terrible people and they're exploiting us and, case closed, right? A lot of the people I went to college with were thoughtful, empathetic, smart, interesting people who, when we were seniors and trying to decide what to do next, decided to go work for Google or Meta. Some of them ended up being some of the first executives at those companies in their roles, right? And I know them to be, honest, candid people who wanted to make the world better with their skills. The same was true when I originally met Mark Zuckerberg, like in the 2006 to 2008 timeframe is when I covered the company. And then later when I met Sam Altman around 2017, when I profiled Sam Altman, both Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman struck me when I spent time with them as very thoughtful people who were very ambitious and really felt that there was a way to make the world better using technology that they could bring about if they had the right resources and connections. The reason I give all that setup is to say that I think we do ourselves a disservice when we say, like, there are these villains and then there's us and the villains are exploiting us. Because I think what has really happened is that we together, all of us, like me and you and Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman and all of us, have created these systems that incentivize the creation of big technology company owned platforms that are built upon exploiting us. And what I mean by that is that people like Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman need to get funding from somewhere for the companies that they are running. And in order to get that funding, they have to make the case to investors that they're going to make those investors more money. And at the same time, they want a lot of people using their products, which they think are making the world better. And so that sets up a dynamic in which, like, there are these products that are available for free to a lot of us. They need to make money from those products. And so they need to find a way to turn our free use of those products into financial benefit for themselves and for their investors. The reason I implicate us in this also is that we could decide not to use the products. We could be like, well, listen, we know your game. We know this is ultimately going to end up in our exploitation. It's going to end up in widening the gap in knowledge and therefore power between ourselves and you, big technology companies. And therefore, we're going to draw a line in the sand and say, no, we're not going to use these products. And yet, many of us continue to use the products. I argue in the book and in general, because we actually do find something useful about those products, right? And so that's what I find really interesting. I mean, I think that's what, having met some of these people, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman, or just people I knew in college who ended up working for these companies, allows me to see. Because having met these people, it is a little difficult for me to say, like, I'm a victim, they are my oppressor, that's just the way the world is. And, you know, I'm using these products because I'm forced to. They're making me use these products because they have an insidious plan to take over the world, right? I think we all are guilty in this complex relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and it's the same is true with Google, right? Like, these guys created Google, and at first they were like, we're not even going to do any advertising. We don't want to exploit our users. That was what they were originally. Remember the whole "don't be evil" mantra of Google, and of course, Google's like bread and butter has been advertising for a long time. They've made billions of dollars off ads. So that was, I don't know if it was an outright lie, but it was definitely, it proved to not hold. Let's just put it that way.
I mean, and that's what I'm talking about. Like, I bet that those Google founders in good faith said that they didn't want to run advertising because they felt like it was in tension with their "don't be evil" motto. But like, that company exists as part of a system in which, you know, Google couldn't have continued to exist the way it existed or the way they wanted it to exist without funding. And that funding is tied up with promising the funders that you're going to make them a return on investment, which ultimately gets bound up with finding ways to exploit the information of their users. And the same, you know, and interestingly, with Google, that happened around the time of the .com downturn. So investors were like, hey, wait a minute, we actually are going to put some pressure on you now to figure out how to make some more money, Google. And then Google did. With Facebook, now Meta, it happened after the 2008 recession. So Facebook was sort of plugging along. And after that recession, they started facing pressure from investors to start figuring out how to make money. And that is when they started going all in collecting more information about people and people's connections to one another, which is part of what laid the groundwork for the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in which, you know.
Well, can you explain what that is briefly? Is there a way to put Cambridge Analytica in a nutshell? Because it's a story that I think is very important.
Yeah.
You know, that more Americans in particular should know about.
Yeah. So this was a scandal in which, and I'm going to say a very basic version, in which a company working together with a researcher used Facebook, the platform, the social media network Facebook, to target political messages to people based on what it was able to glean about those people from their Facebook use. And some argued that that may have influenced elections in the UK, in the US. Facebook always positioned this as a misuse of their technology. Critics of Facebook position it as a sort of inevitable outgrowth of the way in which Meta, then Facebook, built a technology that allowed this kind of targeted messaging.
Okay. Yeah. And it was to help Trump, right? It wasn't like across the board manipulate the
election. It was
election.
to help Trump specifically. That's right. Yeah.
And so people at home on their Facebook were getting like micro-targeted ads that were negative about Hillary or positive about Trump based on their behavior on Facebook. And these people did not know that they were being manipulated in this way.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
So.
And then now, I mean, the interesting thing, you brought up AI that I think is worth noting now is that at OpenAI, Sam Altman has been saying over the years, I think advertising mixed with AI is a really potentially harmful combination. I'm really wary of advertising. Well, late last year, the CFO of OpenAI said to the Financial Times, yeah, we're thinking about looking at advertising. And, we're in 2025. Some economists think that another economic downturn could be coming. And so if the pattern set by Google and Meta earlier holds, this is sort of the time that we should be looking at companies like OpenAI and Google and Microsoft, all of these AI companies, to see what's going to happen if and when there's another economic downturn, how that's going to put pressure on these entities that until now have been really careful not to use our interactions with their products in advertising. It's only just now starting to change, but it's easy to imagine a future in which all of our interactions with these companies' chatbots end up forming the basis for like an even more sophisticated data collection and manipulation effort.
Shouldn't there be laws against this? Like, can't the government pass laws to protect people from this kind of exploitation? I mean, I get that there might be some use of data to help target ads. Like, I don't think it's all like completely verboten, but there's a point at which it starts to become insidious, right?
Yeah. And I think governments at various times have made efforts to limit this, especially more in Europe, for example, than in the US. The counter argument that comes up from companies, which I think is like a really clever counter argument, and maybe like a valid counter argument to an extent, is listen, if you limit us in this way, our competitors in, say, China are going to still keep doing it and then gain dominance over us and use that dominance for geopolitical power that ultimately hurts the interests of the United States, right? That's the kind of counter argument that's typically made by these companies when efforts are made to restrict what they're able to do in order to be financially successful. And so it becomes this sort of self-fulfilling thing where then lawmakers who do get some of their funding from these big corporations, right? The companies have the ear of the lawmakers. They make what lawmakers feel is a fairly convincing national security argument. And then it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that these companies then are able to collect and use our personal information increasingly.
Yeah, it's like, it makes me think about like, is there a through line in terms of when these companies start to turn towards darkness? Because like, I think there's definitely a narrative that you could apply along these lines to, say, Facebook, which might have started out idealistically, though even in its foundings, there was some darkness, with like the Winklevi and Mark Zuckerberg and whether or not the idea was stolen and that whole, lawsuit. But what's the name of the cool billionaire who has a band? I don't know if he's a billionaire, but he's very wealthy. He's a tech guy who was Zuckerberg's advisor. You write about him in the book. I've had him on my show.
Roger McNamee.
Roger McNamee. Yeah, he's been here. He sat in my garage and talked to me.
When you said cool tech guy, I pictured like some 24-year-old. No, he is. I find Roger McNamee so interesting.
Yeah, but he was, he had like a real crisis of conscience in like the 2015, 2016 election cycle, because he had been an early advisor to Mark Zuckerberg. And I believe he introduced Zuckerberg to Sheryl Sandberg.
That's right.
And so then he realized that Facebook data was being used for nefarious purposes and could pose a danger to the Republic and all this stuff. And he wrote to them.
Yes.
And they basically disregarded him.
Yep. That's right.
And I think he's been proven to be correct.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to speak for him, but I have spoken to him about this. I wrote a story for the Wall Street Journal early on about his relationship with Mark Zuckerberg and the way in which he introduced Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, which I write about in the book. But so I without speaking for him, I think I understand his perspective on this and can articulate some of it, which is that it seems to me from talking to Roger McNamee that early on he viewed these issues, these sort of democracy related issues coming up as something that like were sort of like happening, unfortunately, as a byproduct of how these products were set up. But if he could just explain to the leaders of these companies, of Facebook in particular, what was happening, they could address it and stop it from happening. And I think over time, it seems to me that he came to feel that these problems were structural and sort of embedded in the way in which the companies, Facebook in particular in this case, function. So it wasn't like, oops, a mistake took place and all these bad things were allowed to happen, but now we can stop it. It was like, oh, a mistake, something took place because Facebook is engineered in such a way that these kinds of things are going to take place.
I'm like, is it when the investors get involved or when the company goes public and like just the momentum of the thing gets out of hand and the financial pressures come to bear that leaders...
In those three examples we talked about, in the case of Google, Facebook, and now speculatively OpenAI, although there's still a question mark there, it's an economic downturn, right? It's these companies get funding at a time when the economy is flush with resources. Venture capitalists have the money. They're willing to sort of let the company grow. The company grows. The company has a lot of funding, and so they're able to provide their product for free in order to get more people using it, which one could describe as altruistic because they think they're doing something good for the world and so want more people to have access to their product. Or one could describe it as nefarious because they know that ultimately they're going to benefit from use of the product. So they want to get people hooked, right? Before they start doing that. That happens first. Typically, there's then some kind of economic downturn that puts pressure on the company from their investors. And the company then has to make some moves to do more to exploit the resource that they have, which is their users, which they got on board during a time that was more flush. So that seems to be the pattern that has been appearing over and over.
And we might be seeing it repeat itself.
We could, yeah. I mean, and that's where my journalist brain struggles because we don't know, if something has happened a couple of times, we don't know for sure that it's going to happen again. And I'm really interested in thinking about all the possible counter narratives that we could write and then move toward, right? But one possible future certainly is that this happens again with the OpenAIs of the world, right?
Yeah, and it's like an open question for me about how like souls get corrupted and systems, I guess, become corrupted. I talk about it a lot, like with respect to Hollywood. And, I think about it in the context of like Harvey Weinstein, who sort of like ruled this town for decades and was kind of the gatekeeper. Like if you wanted to have the dream career, you sort of had to go through him, if you wanted to like win the Oscar and get the prestige roles. And this guy's like a complete psychopath. And he was the king of the town.
Yeah.
And it just was allowed to function. And treated people horribly, obviously, like in private, but also like at the office. Like I know people who have worked with him and around him. He was a handful. Could be charismatic and, kind of like darkly funny and all the rest. Like that wasn't like he was without his charms, but that's kind of part of the package. And I just think about the way in which like power at the top kind of sets the tone. And then you have all these other good people who are flocking to the industry with all of its money and its fame and its fun and it's a sexy kind of job and, you know, the writing rooms and all that kind of stuff. But then the behaviors that are happening at the top kind of become sanctioned. And it's like, well, if you want to get ahead, then you have to just keep your mouth shut when someone throws a phone at your head because they're mad that you brought the wrong kind of latte or whatever.
Right.
And, you know, you just ghost people or you fire people or, you know, all these kinds of like really kind of crude transactional behaviors just become de rigueur. And people, I think, come into it idealistic and good, but then maybe become corrupted by it. And in the context of tech, I think it's like, wow, you have these nerdy idealists who want to change the world. And then maybe it's these investors with all this money who are putting pressure on them to make it profitable, or it just becomes so profitable that it's like you can make billions of dollars. And it's like Frodo, you know, it's like the ring when like Bilbo Baggins like sees it. I think it just turns people, but like that's what's a fascination to me. It's like, how does this keep happening? And is there any way for people to fend it off?
I mean, I would argue that it is the system is the problem, right? So if we've built a system where the way in which technology gets built is that you put money into it and then the goal is for that money to become more money, like that necessarily by definition lends itself to technologies that are going to be geared toward making money for those people, right? So I wouldn't even blame like the individual investors or the individual CEOs, or rather I would blame them, but I would blame us as well. Because like I said, and I keep saying, we do keep using these products. We feel that we get some benefit from them. And so I think it's hard to say, you know, it's this person's fault or that person's fault or this particular firm on Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley, right? No, it's all of us that have together decided to create the system. But it's interesting to me that you brought up Harvey Weinstein, because the thing that happened with him is that it seemed that was just the way things were. And then people came together, right? Like survivors of Harvey Weinstein's violence, but then also other people who had survived similar violence and created this movement of individuals working collectively, right? And now Harvey Weinstein doesn't have the power he had, right? And I raised that because I think money is very powerful. It's sort of like money is the metric of success in this system that we've created, and money can be used as a tool to amass not just wealth, but political power and social power, right? But we and our sort of collective ability to act that's also powerful and can be a kind of counterforce, I think, to that, to the form of power that we're talking about that sort of like seems invincible. So in the same way that people came together and said, actually, like Harvey Weinstein's a jerk and, a criminal, and let us call that out and not have him be the king of Hollywood anymore. One can imagine futures in which people come together, users of these technologies, people who work at these companies, right? Even some of the executives themselves, who knows, maybe some investors themselves can come together and say, you know what, like, we actually don't like this way of doing things. Let's change things. And then suddenly there's a new narrative about the way things are.
Yeah, here's hoping.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot of power to concentrate in the hands of any individual or group of individuals. There's been a drift, like a pretty discernible drift among the tech, community, like a rightward drift. It seems like a lot of these tech giants and like venture capitalists have kind of thrown their support to Trump. Did that surprise you?
It did not, only because, as I said earlier, like we've created a system in which the goal is for these companies to be successful. Sam Altman, when I profiled him, said and I have this in the book, said something like, listen, I believe the goal of companies the goal of leaders of companies is to make their companies as successful as possible. The job of government is to take care of society, something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And so he sort of laid it out right there, right? Whatever Sam Altman's personal beliefs might be about what the right measures would be to make society a better place, he's ultimately the CEO of OpenAI, right? And so his job, in his view, is to make OpenAI successful. That's true of all the leaders of these other companies. They exist right now in a world in which Donald Trump and his administration are going to dominate for the next, 3.5 years at least. And therefore, they feel that the best way to have their companies continue to be successful at what they see as a critical time in history, right? Where there's competition from Chinese companies that are trying to do the same thing. They're what they see as existential threats to their own success. It makes sense for their businesses to be aligned with Donald Trump. And so I see it less as an ideological shift that has taken place from the left to the right, and more just as evidence that these individuals whose job it is to make their company successful are always sort of following the changing tides. And right now, to be powerful means to align oneself with Donald Trump, right? So what else, that's what they see as the strategy that makes the most sense for their companies.
Good luck with that. I want to say right before I came on to talk with you, Trump had just posted that he was going to slap like a 25% tariff on Apple products that weren't made in the United States. So Tim Cook, who had given money and had tried to sort of bend the knee a little bit before Trump, that's a risky. It's like being in business with a mobster. Good luck.
Yeah. Right.
If you think you're going to be able to curry favor with him and that it's going to be some sort of stable relationship, I think you're probably going to be mistaken. But I want to shift gears and I want to talk with you about the issue of intimacy and like deep feelings, because this is a big part of the book and the most moving part of the book. And maybe in particular for me, when it comes into juxtaposition with this technology. And you wrote a very popular viral essay called Ghosts, which was published in The Believer, which I think is maybe the prime example of what I'm talking about. But you also trace it back to earlier periods in your life when your sister Deepa, who had been diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma, a form of cancer, was in declining health, and you were trying to kind of make sense of it, and you had questions that kind of felt unspeakable. It was like hard to communicate a lot of what you were feeling. And so I don't know what year this would have been, but like Yahoo was the leading search engine at the time. And so you would turn to Yahoo and be asking Yahoo questions. And you were also a teenager coming of age at the time of like dial-up modems and like AOL chat rooms. And so all these things that we do as people, trying to forge like a real connection with others and to communicate our deepest selves to others and to like figure out who we are in relationship to others. And then you have these technologies like turning to a Yahoo search bar to kind of pour your heart out. It's maybe not the thing that like comes to mind first when we think of the phrase pour your heart out. And yet this is what a lot of us are doing. Like you said earlier, like you've written more into a Google search bar over the past couple of decades than you've probably written anywhere else, maybe.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, I think maybe it was because I was reading this book, but I was like starting to ask ChatGPT questions that had like at least some kind of emotional tenor to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, that movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix, where he kind of like falls in love with his AI and develops like a real intimate relationship to it. It's obvious, it's got to be fraught territory, but it also kind of seems like something that's already happening and maybe will continue to happen.
Yeah.
And so then I think about like human to human relationships, which I don't know about you, but like those can leave me wanting. Maybe especially as an adult. I feel like adult friendships and trying to navigate all that and keep a hold of them, it's not necessarily human flaw that thwarts them, though sometimes that's the case, think sometimes it's these other pressures, like just the rat race and just trying to get by and trying to raise kids. And there's so many hours in the day, it gets hard to kind of do it all.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you finally have like 20 minutes to yourself at the end of the day, and you're just like staring at your computer or your phone or at ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, buddy, like, so I don't know, like this book gets into that, and it kind of articulated for me some of these things that I maybe have sensed or have experienced in my life without necessarily being fully conscious of what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It's weird. And that essay that you wrote, Ghosts, where you're sort of trying to kind of sort out grief and find words for a feeling that is so powerful and so complicated. And so like, it's the kind of thing that just leaves you speechless. It makes sense to me. And there's a kind of creative brilliance in your decision to turn to a chatbot to see if it could help you. And the results were really like emotionally powerful in ways that, I don't know, were probably a little bit surprising to you as you were doing it.
Yeah, I mean, everything you're saying resonates with me. I think, capitalism in general and technological capitalism more recently have created these conditions that are alienating, right? That alienate us from other human beings, from our family members, from our friends, from our communities. A lot of us, don't live where we grew up, which isn't inherently a positive or negative thing, but, we are losing touch with other human beings, I think. And into that dynamic comes these technologies that sort of hold out the promise of like doing something sort of like what another person could do, right? So first, it was like AOL chat rooms where you could talk to strangers about, your deepest secrets or desires or questions, which I write about in the book as being sort of like my formative experience with the internet. And then it was search engines where rather than having to have an uncomfortable conversation with somebody you actually knew in real life about your fears over your sister's cancer diagnosis, my fears over my sister's cancer diagnosis, I could go to Yahoo and ask it and nobody would judge me. I wouldn't, make my sister or my parents, like I wouldn't activate their grief because I wasn't asking them the question, right? Later, it was social networks, where, you could post something and see that some people had liked that post, and that would make you have this little jolt of dopamine. That wasn't quite the jolt that you get from actually connecting with other human beings, but maybe was like a close enough simulation of it that it was satisfying. And then now, most recently, big technology companies, by the way, using all of that information that we've put on the internet, all of the text that we've published on the internet in order to train these AI models that can generate text and images, have now created these products deliberately meant to mimic the way in which empathetic, kind, polite, professional human beings interact with one another, right? So this is like the apotheosis of a long-running trend in how these companies, the industry, the system itself created certain conditions and then built products that purportedly address those social conditions. So yeah, I mean, I, as somebody who came of age with the internet, the early internet, and kind of grew up with it, have had all these instances in my life where I have found myself addressing a technology product where, 50 years ago, somebody in my position would actually be speaking to their sibling or spouse or child or best friend or neighbor or therapist or doctor, right? About these things.
Yeah. And so it's like the thing that comes to mind for me is that like a really sophisticated AI, and I'm imagining just like in the movie Her, it's eventually going to be like in your ear, like an earbud is going to be there and you can just talk to it and it can talk right back to you in like real time and with a fluidity that's like pretty close to human seeming, right? And yet there will be no moods. There will be no like fluctuations or different temperaments to navigate. There'll be this kind of like scrubbed nature to the dialogue, and conflict won't be there, or the possibilities for conflict or disagreement, or, you know, the AI is always going to want to do what you want to do. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So like what happens to human relationships, which are already, I think, usually kind of difficult and unsatisfying, or often are. What happens to human relationships when people become accustomed to having a chatbot relationship where this thing is just kind of always there for you, ready to answer your questions, ready to make reservations for you? You know what I'm saying? It's like your little guide and servant and guru.
Yeah.
I think that's going to mess with people, because then they're going to be talking to a person. Maybe it'll be a breath of fresh air. Be like, finally, I'm having a fight with somebody, you know? Like,
right.
But it could also be like, yeah, I'm done with people. I'd rather just hang out with my earpiece and just talk to it because it's nice to me, or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, that's one future, right? There's another future where we decide that's not what we want and just shut it down, and we don't end up in a future world in which that's what it looks like. But just sort of playing out the thought experiment. Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately you could even imagine technically an AI pal that does fight with you, right? That like replicates in form the communication you would have with a real human being. And then the question is like, oh, well, if these two things are like pretty much indistinguishable, then is there a problem? And I would argue that like the problem is inherent to the fact that human communication is being replaced by human interaction with a product probably owned by a huge technology company, right? Because for me, the issue is only partly about like the substance of the conversation. It's more importantly to me about power, because human power, sort of like community power, the kind of power that gets Harvey Weinstein to not be the most dominant person in Hollywood, right? The kind of power that changes political systems, depends on human communication with one another, right? We invented communication itself. We invented language. We invented text and oral language and images in order to communicate with one another. Like that was the purpose. And, you know, to sometimes to political ends, right? Like changing political systems, but also just because like we wanted to do that. It was fun. It was interesting. It made us feel connected with one another. It made us feel good. You know, also evolutionarily, humans needed that because we're not that strong, right? And so there are all these reasons that like human communication as something that's fundamentally about connecting with other people is really important. What you have in these AI products, even if they start to sound exactly like your best friend, is ultimately a product owned by a big technology company whose goal is going to be to exploit the information you give it, right? And so the dynamic there is that if you've got something that sounds like your best friend and you're telling it all of the kinds of things you would otherwise tell your best friend, it's almost as if like you can imagine like standing at the headquarters of like Google or OpenAI or whatever, and there are all these little like speakers in the wall, and you're just like whispering. You've got a bunch of people lined up like whispering their secrets into each of these speakers, right? And then there are people, employees and technologies on the inside of this building that are scooping up all of these secrets, packaging them into a product, that product being the opportunity to influence and manipulate us to change our behavior. And we already see it happening. You know, Cambridge Analytica was a version of this, that scandal we talked about earlier. But you could imagine, like, if you sort of fully play out this dystopian idea, the people on the inside of the building are scooping up all the information. The company's goal is to become wealthier and more powerful. So they take all that information and they use it to persuade us to change our political systems in a way that benefits them and not us, right? And it sounds like a sort of like dystopian comic book story or something, but I don't think it's so far off from like the reality of a future we can imagine if we keep going in the direction we're going.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't find myself disagreeing with anything. I was like imagining it. And it seems, I got to say, like these chatbots and AI, there is a real utility to it. It is helpful and it can streamline things. Like there's a real use case for it. Unlike previous technologies, like I spent, a weird year of my life working for like a VR startup. And this was years ago. So like the technology everyone was like, this is it. It's going to happen. We're all going to be wearing headsets. And it was like, no, not unless you're like a super nerdy gamer. But I've been skeptical of the tech world because they're always sort of like messianically trying to kind of like whip up a fervor about the next big thing. And sometimes it's really not the next big thing. They just want you to think that it is to try to create that momentum. But AI, to me, I'm starting to become a believer, like having interacted with it a bit. I'm like, okay, I think people are going to just be using it. And I think that they're going to, maybe it'll be kind of like Amazon where there's a shame attached to it. Because I do feel a little bit of shame. And I think you write about this very well and like with some humor in your book. Like this, and you talk about like a disagreement that you had with a friend regarding your use of Amazon, because I still order stuff from Amazon.
I have been since publishing the book. I wanted rhetorically in the book, there's this, toward the end of the book, I acknowledge that I'm still using a lot of the platforms that I'm critiquing in the book. I wanted to do that rhetorically, but by the end of the book, I had convinced myself of the problems with my own complicity in the success of these companies. And so I've gradually been divesting myself of some of these platforms. Amazon isn't one of them yet, but I'm working on it. I'm working toward it.
But it's so hard to divest yourself. Like that's part of what's so insidious about this is that like I feel trapped almost. It's like, oh my God, like I don't have time to go shop here, and here and get the stuff that I would need. And I don't have 2 weeks to wait for a book to arrive at my local indie, when they have to put it on special order. So, I don't know. It's frustrating. And maybe it's just laziness, or maybe it's just the ways in which these things have changed. The economy has changed and our lives have changed under the pressures of capitalism or whatever you want to call it, so that you feel like, how can you get rid of your smartphone? And then it's like, okay, well then how am I going to do photos of my kids? And if I need to get somewhere and I need a map, like, am I pulling out the atlas? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's a mess.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's like, it's uncomfortable to say, I'm not equating me and you with Jeff Bezos exactly, but I do think our reasoning is not as dissimilar from the reasoning of people like Jeff Bezos themselves as we would like to think it is, right? But the reason I write so much, I think in some ways, I think my whole book is about complicity, right? And the reason I'm so insistent about our complicity is because it like opens up a window of hope too, and a window for our agency to do that, for us to do something with our agency. And what I mean by that is like, if it's the case that we live in a world in which we use these products only because we're forced to by these companies and we have no other choice, it would then follow that like we are definitely moving toward a future in which these companies will like continue to compound their wealth, their power, be able to manipulate us using that. On the other hand, if it's the case that we use these products partly because we choose to, because we see some personal benefit in it, then that means we have a choice. That means we could together decide to move into a different future in which we are using other methods to fund and operate the technologies that we find genuinely like useful or fun or entertaining in our lives, right? So, I'm not insisting on complicity just like to make us all feel bad about ourselves. It's to say like, well, if it's the case that we have a choice here, that's exciting because there are all kinds of other choices we could choose to make.
So are you hopeful about the future?
Yeah. I am. I think my novel, which you and I talked about in the previous episode, was all about like imagining a fairly dystopian future, which is a potential future certainly that I can see us moving toward, and writing about it, right? Like describing that potential future. The interesting thing, like the exciting thing about being in the present is that I really do believe there are all kinds of possible futures we could imagine and then move toward. And like, we have an opportunity now to do that. Society changes all the time. Like, there have been all kinds of big shifts historically in how we organize ourselves. And so it isn't inevitable that this path that we're on toward big technology domination continues in this direction, because we could decide that we don't want that to be the case and we could choose a different path.
Let's hope that things go in a better direction than they're currently going. That's the best I can say. And I always close by asking my guests what they are working on. Like, is it just like celebrating the publication of this book, or do you have like another book in the pipeline?
I'm always working on journalism, but in addition to that, I am trying to finish a play that is a stage adaptation of my essay Ghosts, which I started a couple of years ago and have been working on. I have an idea that gave me the like playwriting bug. And so I have another play idea in my mind that I want to get on the page. And I do have another novel that I'm working on that I feel fairly close to finishing, knock on wood.
Oh, wow. Any hints as to, like, you don't have to synopsize the plot, but can you just talk about like what its concerns are?
Yeah, the novel is sort of like all about what we've just been talking about. But unlike my first novel, which is like the literal story of a tech CEO who tries to take over the world, this new one is situated like among real people who are users of technology living in the world. And it engages very much with like these questions of complicity and who's guilty when something goes wrong with technology products.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to all of it. Vauhini, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me, and congratulations on Searches.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Brad.
Okay, there we have it. That was my conversation with Vauhini Vara about her new book, Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age, available now from Pantheon. Fascinating, this book and this conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I recommend it. You can find Vauhini on the internet at vauhinivara.com. I believe she's on Instagram. Didn't we talk about her being on Twitter? But not really. And I think maybe now she has a Bluesky account. So, you can track her down there. And one more time, the book is called Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age, available from Pantheon, wherever books are sold. Go get your copy right now. Don't forget to subscribe to The Otherppl Show. If you haven't done that yet, hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. And you can follow me on Bluesky and Instagram. Sign up for my newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. I would love it if you did. If you listen to this show regularly, if you appreciate the work that I do and you want to be able to continue to enjoy The Otherppl Show, I hope you will join the Otherppl Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this podcast going into the future. If you want to get an Otherppl t-shirt just in time for summer, you can cut the sleeves off. You could make it into a belly shirt. Send photos if you do that. You can get an Otherppl t-shirt. You can also sign up for the Otherppl book club. That is my book club. Do all of the above at the show's official website, otherppl.com. And the book club is great. I feel like you should do that. You get a new book delivered to your door every 30 days for just $9.99 a month. To this date, I have not changed the price on the book club. The book club's been around for like 12, 13 years, maybe longer. That's less than the cost of a book for a book delivered to your door every month. And then I interview the book club author on this show. What's not to love about that? I feel like that's like the deal of the century. So check out the book club and get an Otherppl t-shirt at otherppl.com. Be sure to join the wait list for my new company over at www.deepdive.audio, the debut course from Deep Dive. is called How to Write a Novel. I am the host. Vauhini Vara is one of the dozens of featured instructors in the course, more than 50 hours of instruction from all of these leading writers. It is a writing course like none other, like no other. I sound like one of the announcers for the Masters, that golf tournament. A tradition like no other. You know what I mean. I'm trying to sell this thing. Got to do it. And it's good. Like, the idea is that I want to create this thing that's like so big and so useful and so helpful that it's good for people and they feel good about it. They're like, oh, I bought this thing and I got a great deal. I want to deliver a great deal to customers. So, I'm a little bit sleep deprived. The past few months have been one of the most intense work periods of my life, but we're getting close to launch. So check out Deep Dive at www.deepdive.audio. And what else? Oh, if you have 2 minutes and you want to help me out, do me a quick favor. Give this show a rating wherever you listen. It takes a second. So Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen to this show, there's a way to rate it. So give it a rating, preferably a 5-star rating. And then if you can write a little review, preferably a glowing review, I would be much obliged. It helps the show in the algorithm, and it helps it find new listeners. Last but not least, I have books out. You can read my books, if that sounds good. My most recent book is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. It is a work of autofiction. So if you really want to get to know me, especially as I existed like a few years ago, you can get it. It's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. It's available in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook, so if you can't get enough of my voice and you just need more, you can get the audiobook. I'll read my book to you. So if you're really lazy and you don't want to read it yourself, and you want to hear me some more, it's an option. All right, so coming up on Sunday, I will be back with another character studies episode. I have a good one in the works with a 40-year-old filmmaker and visual strategist who works for NASA. So that's coming up on Sunday. Stay tuned.